This is Mel, son of Becky Harband, in the blue part of the diagram in the tree. Grandson of Sarah Lebovner. Okay, I'll sit too. All right, fine. And I'm Rob, Mel's son. Now, Dad, want to start off as early as we can with remembrances that maybe your mom gave you from her time growing up in Tarnapol before she even came across the ocean to Galveston. So do you have some things that she told you over the years, that you heard over the years about her childhood time?
Well, just to reassure everybody, this is not going to be a prolonged dissertation. Yeah. One of the things that stands out in my mind when I was a little boy, about this size, was my mom's description of the lifestyle in her hometown of Tarnapol, which at that time was part of Austria, as has already been mentioned. And there are two things that stand out in my life, and one is that she frequently would allude to Franz Joseph, the emperor, in highly positive tones, and she would frequently mention that he was very nice to the Jewish people. And that was something that was imprinted in her mind, and she mentioned that frequently. And the other thing about her time in Tarnapol that I recall her describing to me was that this took place, she was born in 1890, and so this would take place in the last decade of that century and the first few years of the 20th century. These were the good old days before there were such things as washing machines and wringers and dryers and all that jazz. And so if someone's clothing needed cleansing, the principle that was followed was that they would walk down with the clothes, of course, to the nearby river, and they would dip the clothes in the river and wring them out by hand, and then take them back to their house and hang them out in the sun to dry. And this was without using laundry soap or any of that sort of material. And that was the state of the art in those days. Now, as I said, she was born in 1890, and when she was around 15 or 16 or 17, give or take a year or two, it became her turn to come to the Promised Land, where we now reside. And she described to me her experience taking the boat across the Atlantic Ocean, and her social status was such that she was in what was referred to as steerage, down in the bottom of the boat. But she dealt with that with no great difficulty. She was alone. And when she arrived in this country, she landed at Galveston, Texas. And I think someone had already mentioned that New York and some of the other sites where people would come were considered off base for people of their faith. And so she landed in Galveston and then immediately came to San Francisco, where I don't know the exact number, but roughly about a dozen of her siblings were present, or at least a good part of that group. And so she came directly to San Francisco and started her life story there. And she spoke not a word of English, nor could she read English or write English. She was fluent in Yiddish. And this would be when she might have been 16 or 17 or 18, something like that. And she got a job in a 5 and 10 cent store. There used to be stores called 5 and 10 cent stores. I'm not so sure they still exist. But in any event, she got a job as a clerk in a 5 and 10 cent store. And her responsibility was to stand behind a counter where customers would approach and ask to purchase one or another item that would be on display in the counter. And my mother, Rebecca, or Becky, had no clue whatsoever as to what the customer was asking for. But in her wisdom, she would act like this and point her finger around trying to find the object, and the customer would say, "Oh, here it is." And that's how she learned the name of the objects. And so she conned her way through the circumstances of that time. And then somewhere in the neighborhood of...
It's not that different from the contemporary retail business.
Somewhere around 1909 or 08 or something, she happened to meet a gentleman whose name was Isaac. And they seemed to like each other, and they became attracted to each other. And they were married in, it was probably 1909 or 1910. And prior to that, Isaac had had come to this country through Ellis Island, and his, I'll try to abbreviate this, his name was Isaac Kaplan, and he had an older brother and a younger brother, and his older brother came to this country through Ellis Island first, and when the older brother arrived at Ellis Island and came and stood in line, and then when his turn came up to the desk, the clerk asked him what his name was, and he said Kaplan, Kaphan, and the clerk said, "You mean Kaplan?" And his older brother said, "Yeah, Kaplan," and that's how the name became Kaplan. And then when my father came, he took the name of Kaplan, and his brothers subsequently, and so on. Anyway, my father and his sister also, when the Kaplans came, they started out in New York. And my father was in the, eventually ended up working in a restaurant, and his sister working in a restaurant. And then after the earthquake in San Francisco, which I think was 1906 or so, there was a trend for people to want to move west, especially the particular ethnic group that my father's family lived or were members of. And so they came to San Francisco. And that's how it happened that my mother met my father. My father's name was Isaac Kaplan. And my father started out working as for the streetcar company in San Francisco, either as a motorman or as a conductor. And eventually he and his older brother got into the furniture business. They had their own store. And at that point, that's when my father met my mother, and they married in San Francisco. My wife is pointing at her watch, which probably means that it's ticking. And so they were married around 1909 or 1910, something like that. And they had 2 sons while they were living in San Francisco. One named Sidney, who was born in 1912, and one named Leon, who was born in 1914. And subsequent to that, for reasons that remain unknown, they decided to move down to Southern California, and they established their family in the Los Angeles area. And then in 1924, their third son was born. And so far, that third son is still surviving, barely. Anyway.
Still the baby of the family, I guess.
Right,
Yeah.
right. And the last, a couple of anecdotes that I'll mention about my mother was one, that she was not fluent in English by the time she got down here, but she did enroll in night school and learn English as a second language. She really became quite fluent from that point on. And the other thing, it was the norm that ladies did not operate motor vehicles. And my mother knew a lady whose name escapes me now, who would tend to do the cleaning work in our house and so on. And that lady knew how to drive an automobile. So my mother asked that lady to teach her how to drive, unbeknownst to anyone else in our family. And she learned how to drive, and she got a license to drive a car in California. And once she got her license, the law was laid down, thou shalt not drive anymore. And so she didn't drive after that.
Wow.
And I suppose the last one.
Let's. Why don't we wrap up with something happened when you were about 6 years old that I think involved some hairbands.
Right. I was on my own just about to say that. Okay. I had 4 grandparents, a paternal grandfather and paternal grandmother, and a maternal grandfather and a maternal grandmother. Of the 4 grandparents, I only had specific direct face-to-face contact with my maternal grandmother, whose picture is on the wall there, Sarah LaBeouf. And I met her once and possibly twice when I was a little boy. I might have been 8 or 10, I forget how old. She spoke not a single word of English. I spoke not a single word of Yiddish, or any other language for that matter. And we had a rather cool, formal introduction. I think she might have patted my head once. And then, and this was in our house in Los Angeles. Had brought her down to visit. And then she spent the remainder of her life in San Francisco. And I might possibly have seen her once in San Francisco. But essentially, I had what could best be described as a negligible relationship with my grandparents on either side of the family.
And then what happened by the house?
Oh, yes. I had another brother, a cousin, Charlie, who was really a great guy. And I had a number of contacts with him. Thanks for reminding me. And when I was, I don't know how old, 8 or 10 or something. Oh, I should point out that at that time in our lives, we lived in the middle of Los Angeles in single-family houses, and there was no such thing as a garbage disposal. There was no such thing as picking up waste materials unless those waste materials had been processed, but more specifically, paper goods had to be disposed of, and every house had an incinerator in the back. In our case, we had a detached garage, and there was a space behind our detached garage, and our incinerator was there, and we would take any things like the newspapers or other paper goods, and we would incinerate them. We'd light a match and burn them up, and we'd collect the ashes and take them out and then the municipality would pick up the ashes. And this is the norm of those days. And one day I was with one of my buddies, and I don't remember whether I was 8 or 10 or 12 or whatever.
I thought it was 6.
Or maybe it was 6.
Yeah.
It could be. That's a nice round number.
Yeah.
I don't even know what it's supposed to be. And I really don't know.
Go ahead.
All right. And so we were fooling around, and we
What?
figured since the incinerator was there and it had some newspapers in it, and they had not been incinerated, we would do a good turn. So we got some matches, and we lit the incinerator to burn up the newspapers. And we sort of overdid it a wee bit, and everything caught fire, including the back fence. And this was in the late afternoon on a nice, clear day, and we had no clue as to what to do about managing what was becoming an increasingly ominous fire, when up rode on our driveway from San Francisco was Charlie Harband, who had come down to visit us. And he rode up just at that critical time, and we pointed out what was going on to him, and he immediately reacted, and he extinguished the flames. And it left some charring of the wood fence in the back, but it prevented a conflagration. And I'll never forget Charlie for that heroic act, as well as his being very nice in a number of other ways when I was a little bit older. And at the risk of using too much time, I'll just say thank you and turn over the meeting back to Ron.
All right. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you very much.